Welcome to the Advanced Women's Health Podcast, where we empower women with the latest insights and advice on holistic health. From cutting-edge medical research to practical wellness tips, our mission is to help you thrive at every stage of life. Join us as we explore topics ranging from hormonal balance and reproductive health to nutrition and mental well-being. Whether you're seeking solutions for a specific health concern or simply want to enhance your overall wellness, you're in the right place. Let's embark on this journey to better health together. This is the Advanced Women's Health Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode with Dr. Michelle Musser. I said it right this time?
You did. Congrats. We did the thing.
This is the fun part about working with practitioners that you've known a very long time is you've never had to say their last name until you do, and then you say it wrong. So Michelle and I have worked together on and off for a bajillion years, like way back in the years of CCNM at school. So she is definitely one of my most long-standing Kool-Aid drinkers. And I am just so excited for you guys to get to know her a little bit more today. So Dr. Michelle, dive in. How did you get into this crazy thing called naturopathic medicine?
I'm the OG Sarah Kool-Aid drinker. So the very first, I got into naturopathic medicine for a couple of reasons. Honestly, it was just like a really organic development. But my dad, as you know, and I think I've talked about this a couple of times, has neurological disease. He has MS and Parkinson's. And so it was growing up seeing just like how there was just such a void in the medical system where the kind of care he was getting was just not sufficient. Not to say that it wasn't helpful, like it certainly had a time and a place, but that there just wasn't enough there and his health wasn't supported and he wasn't doing good. And so it was like, there's got to be something else to this bit. And it was through an internship that I had to do in my undergrad that, I shadowed a naturopath and I was just like, well, what is this? And to see how people would get better and like the scope of care and like the time that people got to spend together and like connecting the pieces of the puzzle was just like, okay, that like this resonates on all levels. And so it was just like a no-brainer for me that I'm like, this is what we're doing and applied and here we are. So
it's so funny because so many of you guys found out through some kind of forced internship program. Like it was just hearing everyone talk about it. I'm like, oh, that's so interesting why more schools don't have that. Like I never had to do that.
Yeah.
None of my friends had to do that, right? It was just very focused on academics. Like you go into a research lab or do something else, right? But it wasn't necessarily like in work placements, which I think is really what education should be, to be honest.
And it was one of these things where like all of my peers went into physiotherapy placements and I was like, I can't do that. Like I just had this deep sense of knowing that I'm like, love physiotherapists, refer to them constantly, see their value, see one myself, don't want to be one. Like that's not like, that doesn't resonate for me at all. But I knew I wanted to be in health. And it was like our counselor who was just like, well, you're into like natural things. You're kind of a hippie doodad, but like you like sciences and health matters. And I was like, yes. And so she's like, check this out. And so it was just like divine intervention as far as that goes, that it just kind of all lined up at the right time. But it was absolutely the internship. Like I had not heard of naturopathic medicine prior to that. Like that was not common knowledge at all.
I'm just thinking there's probably going to be students listening to this. So was it known going into your degree that you needed to do some kind of placement, or was that like a course that you selected? What did that, as someone who is not engaged in this world, tell me more.
So I am probably not the right person to ask because like I knew I wasn't ready to leave Sudbury when I had applied for school. And so I applied to 3 science programs and kin was the hardest to get into. There was an additional like barrier to entry. And so it's like, must be the best program. Don't know what that says about me. And so I opted
for a lot. I
opted for the hardest path forward. And so I absolutely did not know anything about like, that was not a driving factor. But I know that like within that particular program, they do a lot of like unconventional things. But no, put simply, I didn't know that it was something that was part of the curriculum, but really grateful, obviously, in retrospect that it was. And I think it was helpful for all of my peers too, because everyone who went into their internship ended up either learning that's like for sure what they wanted to do or absolutely not what they wanted to do and veered in a different path because they were like, I thought it was and it wasn't. So like learning lesson to anybody who's considering anything is like, try to engage yourself in whatever it is that you're considering doing because the actuality of it can be entirely different than like what we fantasize it to be, right?
Totally. So then what was the winding path from school to where you are now with respect to what you love to treat and all that kind of stuff?
I graduated and very shortly thereafter realized that I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing very well. Respect to CCNM, but like I needed clinical guidance. And so it was through, you had reached out about mentorship and you started to launch that program. And that like, I mean, I promise I'm not being paid for this for anyone who's listening, but like changed my life and my practice, like for the better. Like it was really meaningful in terms of just learning like how the body works and how it's all connected and like the foundations of health. And like once you see things through that lens, like you literally can't turn it off, but it makes so much sense. Like, yeah. Anyways.
Well, we get results. I think that's the thing, right? But from that space, the reality is there are a lot of people listening to this that have been told for a very long time they're complicated. And I think the more clearly you understand physiology, the simpler health can get. Like
Yes.
you treat a lot of very complex cases, a lot of very complex people. But when you do it from a lens of immunological dysfunction, gut microbiome, liver and bile acids, one of Michelle's faves, aside from histamine, which we'll get into today. When we look at it from a blood sugar dysregulation, like when we can piece together those foundations, you're like this and this, let's go.
Yeah, it makes it so easy to manage. It's straightforward. And then it's just about like making it make sense for patients. And so it's a really beautiful gift that you've given me. So thank you on that front. But yeah, that's ultimately how I ended up here in terms of that transition of things. But I really like in terms of what I like to treat, because I think that's essentially what you were getting at is that like women's health truly at its core, I appreciate because I feel like women don't understand a lot about their body. Like there's just so much about that we can unpack, but I really appreciate treating like PMS and premenstrual dysphoria disorder, PMDD, and all things histamine. And I think a lot of what we joke about is that we like to treat ourselves. And as somebody with seasonal allergies and itchy eyes and all of those things, that it's really helpful both to like see what works for myself, but then also be able to help patients from a place of experience myself. And so like also being a mother, like I thoroughly appreciate preconception care and fertility care and postpartum care in particular, because women are not supported in the reach. But those are kind of women's health in its entirety is really what I enjoy. But those particular areas are favorites and soft spots for me.
So then this histamine word.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys will hear this come up a lot in the podcast, a lot. And so we're early in the game. I want you to walk us through what that is. Alice is going to talk about PMS and PMDD and all of that kind of stuff.
That.
So just introduce histamine. What is that? Why is it? How can it be related to itchy eyes and your hormones? Walk us through.
So the way I explain it to patients, and you might have a better meaning, so I'm all ears, but histamine is an inflammatory complex that can mediate a number of different reactions. So it's important for the sleep, it's important for digestion, and it's an important part of the immune system. So the example that I give people is always allergies because it's a really tangible one, that in an allergic reaction, your body thinks that something that is not dangerous is dangerous, and your immune system is essentially trying to neutralize that to keep you safe. And so if you think of histamine being released in that context, one of many things that histamine does is create vascular leakiness to allow immune cells to go from the blood to wherever the infection is, right? And so depending on where that's happening, if we're seeing it in the brain prior to your period, then we can see premenstrual headaches, right? Because there's a relationship between your hormones and histamine and how those two things interchange. If it's happening in other places, then we can see an increase in like swelling and redness and itchiness, congestion, those types of things that's happening kind of in your face and nose. If it's happening at the level of the gut, we can see different symptoms. So like where histamine is being triggered is going to determine what symptoms we see kind of come of that. And there are a number of things that can trigger histamine. And it's about identifying what's the vulnerability in the first place, be it genetically and due to gut hormones and all of that jazz. And then what are the specific triggers for that people and how do we go about managing all of that in the context of the 7 or 8 things that cause disease, right? So I know that was really macro, but essentially histamine is something that can mediate a number of reactions. And it's really about figuring out what those are in very specific people.
Absolutely. What I always say is there's different arms of the immune response when we're being like super big in general.
We're going out.
Yeah, exactly. We have an arm of the immune response that's targeted, right? It's targeted at bacteria or a virus, or with an autoimmune condition, we call it antibodies, right? So it's targeted at yourself. So that's targeted. We also have arms of our immune response that are non-specific, meaning there's something wrong and let's try to deal with it, right? And when we have issues, as Michelle was talking about with respect to that, it's called the innate immune response, histamine and mast cells, which are one of the cell types that makes histamine. But when we have these general issues with our immune response, it shows up everywhere, right? Whereas we think about immune responses that, oh, I have inflammation in my knees. Most people don't think about immune responses, AKA I have anxiety and brain inflammation. Plus, I get redness on my skin when I touch it. Plus, I have congestion and postnasal drip. Plus, I get bloated and gassy and pain. Plus, I get premenstrual headaches and period cramps, and like the list goes on.
And I have alcohol or fermented foods and then blow up in any of those directions, right?
Exactly. And so that's where it's almost surreal when we talk about some of these, and especially immune pathways, how whole system focused the responses are. But I love when, again, we get down to that core foundation of when your blood sugar's off, you're going to feel it head to toe. When your immune system is off, that very innate, you just got to survive today, you're going to be off head to toe. And that's where, in my opinion, the medical system struggles. It honestly limps along, because you can't go see an allergist and an OB-GYN and a rheumatologist and a sleep clinic and get them to integrate their knowledge and say, oh, this is a histamine issue. This is an immune issue. Go from here. But it can show up such that you need a rheumatologist and an allergist and an OB-GYN and a sleep clinic. And you're like, I am broken. Right? Yes. I am foundationally, look at all the care I need. And people, they get a med for each.
Yep.
Right? They go on the Verfintrol pill and get Blexten. And then the rheumatologist doesn't know what to do because it's not their department. And the sleep clinic is like, here's some Zopiclone. And they're like, look at me. Now I'm screwed. When it's one friggin' thing.
That's entirely it. And it's interesting because these are the patients who are walking in I'm a hot mess express. And I'm like, no, you're not. And you piece it together, and it's really powerful for patients because they're just okay, finally, I have a couple of relatively uncomplicated answers versus 50 conditions, right? It's just your foundation is off. So let's fix that piece. And then you feel well. It doesn't have to be so complicated.
Which I get, I'm going to say, as a patient who sat on the other side of this table, it can feel really annoying when someone says, it's not that complicated. You're like, I am so complicated. Right? And it's
an invalidation perspective. It's just one of these things that it's the physiology is uncomplicated. Your experience of that can be messy and just obviously valid in whatever trials and tribulations you've had with that. But it's so not to invalidate that piece, it can still be challenging and simple on paper, right?
And not to toot our own horn, but this is why you work with experienced practitioners who have a team of people around them and who have a deep knowledge of physiology and the research, and also deeply care about your experience above everything else, because it becomes less and less complicated. We were joking on the call this morning, and I've said this 12 times on the podcast. I'll say it again, right? A probiotic, a fish oil, and vitamin D are not going to solve the problem. We were on our team call and I left to get a supplement, and I came back and I heard something about omegas and vitamin D, and I was like, no. But they were just pulling my chain.
We can do it. And that's the thing is that, but when you know better, you can do better. Right. And it's just it's that graduating from school, not knowing better. And then when you learn about how this works in actuality, it's a whole different ballgame. Your tools open up substantially. And then the impact that you can have obviously also opens up substantially with that. And like you said, the result that you can get with a lot of the treatments that we do is earth shattering. It's amazing.
Today's episode is brought to you by none other than Advanced Women's Health.
If you are interested in diving in deeper to your health, if you are finally ready to feel like yourself, and you are finally over hearing everything's normal, everything's fine, and you want a deeper dive into your healthcare, then we are here to help you. We are currently helping patients in British Columbia and Ontario, Canada. But don't worry, if you're in another province, still reach out, get added to the wait list as we expand coast to coast. We cannot wait to work with you. Check out the show notes for more information on how to get started. So then let's bring this to hormones. So how does histamine interact with hormones? What does that look like in the body? Run that for me.
Yeah. So histamine and estrogen have a feed-forward relationship with each other. So the more histamine you have, the more it increases estrogen. The more estrogen you have, the more it increases histamine. In somebody who is not on hormonal birth control, who cycles regularly, like a healthy period type person, we're going to see like a rise in estrogen just prior to ovulation. It's one of the things that's triggering ovulation, that it's high and short. And then in the second part of the cycle, which is from ovulation to bleed, we see more of a sustained higher period of estrogen. And so when we're seeing cyclical symptoms of headaches around ovulation and premenstrually in particular, or like congestion or anxiety or what have you, sleep disturbances, palpitations. I mean, I could run the list, diarrhea, abdominal pain, cramping. But if we're seeing cyclical symptoms relative to your cycle, that those two things can very much be related given that relationship between those two things. And so it's really important even just to track when you're experiencing things, because I can't count how often people are like, it's random, there's no pattern. I'm like, write it down on a calendar. And they're like, well, look at that. And I'm like, yes. And it's helpful to know that heading into things because it changes how we treat.
1,000%. And that's even like today, right? My period is here. And I notice I look outside, my eyes are more watery. Like it's all of those types of things where I'm sensitive to it and I know it now. But I have patients who are like, oh, I get sick once a month. Why do I get sick once a month? Why do I feel congested once a month? Like there's all of these types of things that can be happening that when you understand can give you power. Like I don't feel any type of feeling about being congested today. You know what I mean? I'm not like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get sick and what's happening. And like we all have flu PTSD right now. Let's be honest, right? We have sick kids, we have lots going on. So you can get in your head about simple symptoms like having a bit of a scratchy throat or like a nasal congestion. And so I think it's so powerful to be like, oh, no, period's here. Let's do this thing. As opposed to now what feelings.
Going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So then what does estrogen do? Right? Walk me through that in a little bit more detail, because you were saying also like feed forward, right? So as you explained, they grow on each other.
Yeah. One increases the other.
Yeah. So when we specifically talk about estrogen, how would someone other than headaches think about estrogen being high in that?
Yeah. So estrogen and progesterone, it becomes a whole conversation. So just for anyone who may not know, progesterone is something that's only coming from ovulation. So no ovulation, no progesterone. Again, this is somebody who's not on hormonal birth control. But ultimately, it's all about keeping things in check in terms of like a relativity. So ultimately, we want estrogen to be in a specific place. And when it is excessively high or relatively high to progesterone, we can see symptoms of like PMS in particular. So like the irritability, the breast tenderness, like cravings, like those types of things. But also like estrogen is also like, it's a prolific hormone. So it causes growth of things. And so like it can increase your uterine lining to be thicker and therefore bleeds to be heavier and more painful. Those types of things. And I mean, we won't hop into the cancer piece of things because I don't think it's relevant for the vast majority of people, but it can cause growth of things like that in specific places. But that being the way that I look at it from that perspective.
Gotcha. And then how did we get here? I think that's honestly a question that we patients want to know all the time. And we're seeing so many of these histamine issues. There's a whole story that we won't tell about why we're seeing so many more histamine issues right now. But one of the questions I think we get is when we have these immune patterns that are so common, right? It's like 9 out of 10 people raise their hands when you were like period cramps and potentially heavy periods at times and PMS and headaches and congestion and allergies and sleep. Like everyone's like,
Yeah,
yes,
the sleep
yes.
piece for sure. Like the premenstrual, like can't sleep, or the insomnia piece, like that one's alive and well. Didn't mention that, but 100%. That's something that we see. In terms of how we got here, a number of factors. I mean, we always talk about how we live in the toxic soup and like the itty bitty shitty committee, which is a little bit of all the things being off. But we know that like your digestive health is really going to impact like your vulnerability from like a histamine perspective. And like that part's alive and well. And people are pooping on a regular basis or a daily basis. And you have like an increase in fermentation and inflammation.
Putrefaction, my favorite word in the whole world.
I don't use it.
Moist and putrefaction are just disgusting words.
Putrefaction is not the one I opt for. Fermentation is the prettier version of that one. But ultimately, like when you have food that isn't moving out of your bowel, that's going to cause issue. And ultimately that in and of itself can contribute to like histamine. We also know that like viruses and immune issues, the thing that we shan't talk about, like absolutely can contribute to the vulnerability there as far as like people being more histaminergic. We know that stress, like anything that's really going to shift people away from like homeostasis, which is like our state of like happy and balanced, for lack of a better word, and somebody with these additional vulnerabilities can experience symptoms, right? So I guess sounds complicated as we're discussing it, but it's really simple in that like we're looking at gut health, we're looking at like their immune health, we're looking at diet for sure, because it can be very much a contributing factor as far as histamine goes. Not that everyone needs to go on a low histamine diet and cut out like avocados and strawberries. If anyone's listening and has these symptoms, don't go down that rabbit hole. You have better options, though it can be helpful. But those tend to be the foundational pieces. But it's really people who have like a genetic vulnerability, and then the itty bitty shitty, the toxic soup, the not managing our stuff well, the sleep, all of that. You throw it all together and then add in some pollen and boom, we have issue, right?
Yeah. So let's stick on the gut piece for a minute, right? Because when we're talking about constipation, obviously my belief structure is there would be a lot less road rage if people were less constipated. And we all know how much road rage there is. So everyone is emotionally and physically constipated at the same time. But what does fermentation mean? How does that show up other than constipation? Like walk me through, because again, like I want to make something that's so practical that we see all day, every day, feel as practical to the person listening as it does to us. So what does this look like?
Yeah. So when people are not having daily bowel movements, and FYI, you can have daily bowel movements that are like little turns every day, or even you can have daily bowel movements and still respectfully be full of poop. And so ultimately we need to make sure that it's not a thing that is happening. But if we don't have full evacuation of the bowel happening on a regular basis, then you can essentially have food that comes and sits and, in your own words, is putrefied based off of the bacteria that's kind of eating it. I've been managing that piece. But if it's not moving out, that's a gas producing process, right? So we can see like bloating and abdominal pain. We can see reflux for sure as a result of all of those things. Because if you think of like a tube and one end is backed up and we're adding stuff to it and then we're letting it create gas and kind of blow up, so to speak, like that's going to head somewhere. And if it can't go out, then it's going to go up, right? So nausea and reflux are things that we can see associated with that as well. Those are the big ones. Are we looking for more detail? Because I'm happy to go down some rabbit holes of LPS, but you always tell me to not talk about it.
Well, I don't think we need to talk about LPS, but what's really important to remember is that there's two big areas in the body where histamine comes from. Again, like there's many. One of them is internal, right? Coming from our mast cells. So this is where histamine can show up in your skin, locally, in your brain, right? And then the other one is bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract. And I think that's where it can feel so complicated, is because you can fix, quote unquote, through antimicrobials and dietary stuff, a lot of the digestive histamine issues. You can move through constipation. You can have histamine issues when you have diarrhea, which again makes people feel overwhelmed, but it's because we actually have to separate those systems, right? We have this kind of internal state of histamine chaos. And well, I guess it's both internal, but technically from your nose and your mouth to your anus is outside your body. It's a closed tube. It's outside your body, which is a little bit of a mind warp.
Yeah.
But
It has to be really selective about what it lets into the rest of your circulating body,
Yeah.
so to speak. So yeah, it is external environment for all intensive purposes. But yes, internal versus like being anything that is not gastrointestinal, and then external being anything from mouth to anus, essentially.
It's such an important system. Just like blood sugar, when there's really important systems in our bodies, we have redundancy. There's like so many different pathways that all converge on one thing to try to keep you safe and protected. And that's the same thing with the immune responses, which is why, again, simplicity looks like we have a bacterial issue, you have an internal systems issue that's triggered by your hormones. Let's treat it and go. Complexity looks like I have a brain issue, a hormone issue, a skin issue, a digestive issue, a bacterial issue. Like, you know what I mean? It's boom, it's out here. So I just wanted to break those things into pieces for people, because it's really easy, especially when you're learning about this, to dissociate, to be like, oh, I don't have constipation. This is not me. That can't be the cause of my PMS. And it's like, yeah, it can. That's one of the categories and sources. And so, as Michelle said, like, we always just have to go back to what is the most unifying feature of this. The nerding out, as you can tell, like, keep a reins on all of the team. I'm like, little nerding, not a lot of nerding like we do internally, right? But that's just to kind of simplify those two arms.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I'm like, we can go down the pathways. I love a pathway until the cows come home. So it's helpful to be able to distinguish between those two for patients. Yeah, in terms of just making it more digestible, for sure.
Aha, digestible.
I wasn't even trying to be punny.
We're so funny over here. So then moving forward to some of the lab testing, because again, like, that's the beautiful thing about a lot of these issues, is that we can see them come into play with some of the immune testing we have. Now, we can't test histamine, frankly. That test is not very accurate because histamine breaks down very quickly. But what are you looking at from a holistic perspective in terms of those favorite labs for histamine imbalances?
Yeah. So one of the easiest ones is like on a CBC, like a complete blood cell count. So it's your red and white blood cells and all of the details around them. There's, under the white blood cell section, the differentials, there's something called eosinophils. And eosinophils are something that mediate allergic reactions and parasitic infections. And ultimately, eosinophils are a place where we can start to see histamine, like signs of a histamine issue with patients, which is super easy. And like, medical doctors will run like through OHIP and is really accessible, which is great. Another one that I like is IgE antibody. So again, it gives us an idea of, from an immune perspective, like how prevalent is mast cell dysfunction and histamine issues. And it gives us a little bit of a barometer in terms of how significant and how prevalent that is in a patient. Those are two tests that I definitely utilize that can be certainly helpful in terms of just getting an idea of what's going on from a histamine perspective. We had also discussed CA-125 is another test that I thoroughly enjoy. And granted, it's not direct in terms of histamine. CA-125 is like a super underrated test. And essentially, it's an ovarian inflammatory marker. It can be a marker of ovarian cancer, like in excessive levels. Granted, that's not generally how we're using it and not something that we're coming across, thank goodness, on a regular basis, but can be really helpful for assessing for endometriosis in particular, or pelvic inflammation, which is, again, it's so hard to diagnose endometriosis. And so any tools that provide us with, between symptoms and then having a marker that is off really propels us in the direction of having confidence around that diagnosis. And there is a relationship between histamine and endometriosis. And so love those tests all in all, in terms of just giving us more clinical information as to where we need to go and what needs to be done.
And we're going to go and do a really deep dive on the podcast on endometriosis, because it's obviously a subject I'm incredibly passionate about. I teach on, Michelle's very passionate about. The reason why it comes up in this conversation is endometriosis is a hormonal, like, it's an inflammatory condition that's affected by hormones, right? So when we look at the arms of the immune system that are affected, when you have endometrial tissue that's allowed to grow places it shouldn't, one of them is the mast cell innate immune response histamine pathway, and then estrogen gets kicked up. And so that's where we always say our endo patients don't always have high EOs, and they don't always have CBCs that are off, or high IgEs, or high CA-125s. But if they do, like, we know how hard it is to get an endometriosis diagnosis. It's becoming a little bit better with better ultrasound technologies and things like that, but it's still hard. So if we have a patient with a high CA125 and we were wondering if that could be causing body pain, like non-typical symptoms, because I have patients who have not been able to get pregnant, who have had really significant bladder issues, who didn't have any period pain.
Yeah, there's such a misconception that period pain and endo have to go together. I've had patients who don't realize they have endo until they've had a C-section for their kids that were unexpected and they're riddled, right? So like those two things are not mutually exclusive in any capacity at all. So it's really helpful to have tools to point you in those directions, because I feel like it's relatively easy to diagnose somebody with frank endometriosis. Like I have a patient who has like all of the signs and symptoms, right? Like just check, like even signs on ultrasound, the whole kit and caboodle, which is fantastic. Not fantastic for her, but like it's clear and the support is evident. It's really for the patients who fall in the in-between, where you're like, you could, you might not, like we're kind of on the fence about things, where these tests can be super, super meaningful in terms of getting you in a direction so that you can get the treatment that you need. That isn't, I find, as prevalent with us, because again, if it sounds like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, and we're going to treat it as such. But that ultimately, like from a Western perspective as well, in terms of getting the support that you might need on that front, this is where those tools can also kind of throw you in a direction, but also just give us an idea, because endometriosis is a condition that has many aspects in terms of how we can go about treating it. And this being one that we want to make sure that is being addressed if it's part of that picture for that person. It isn't always in every case, right?
Absolutely. 1,000%. And I think this is where, again, a lot of the tests we use, a lot of the things that we're doing is saying, how can we get the piece of information to empower and also like translate, right? There's this whole area of translational research and translational medicine, which is saying like, how can we take someone's symptoms, physiology, and some kind of biomarker and put them together so that there's an understanding that can cross boundaries and cross borders, right? And that's always, I think, what we're trying to do is say, how can we have a patient, their support team, us, their family, all on the same page so that they can move to that space of wellness, which is what we're always after.
100%. Well, and the thing is, like, integrative medicine is the best kind of medicine, right? Because ultimately what we do has limitations. What Western medicine does has limitations. And like what any kind of additional therapist of any kind or practitioner offers, like there are limitations in all these places. But when we can work cohesively, it's to the patient's benefit, right? And so being able to speak the same language or, rationalize, justify our train of thought with validated, objective information is a really useful tool for them, for us, for everyone, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I know you are a very busy woman and have a patient coming up soon. So we will wrap up for today. But with that wrap up, I would love to know, what is one thing that you wish women knew more about?
Loaded question. I wish women knew more about their cycles in particular, like the menstrual cycle, how it works, what it is, what the pill does to their body, and that like a menstrual cycle, I say in air quotes, or a bleed with on the pill isn't actually like a menstrual bleed. In order to have menses, you need to have ovulation. And that sounds like semantics until you get into this kind of information when we're having the conversation about what's the
hormones in your immune system. Yeah, it changes everything.
It changes everything. And so, but having that information and appreciating that, like, if you have endometriosis or a vaginal infection and you throw an IUD into the mix, that might be a cause for problems down the road, right? Like, I think that for me, it's really just, I wish that women knew more about their bodies, because when you know more, you can advocate more. I can't count just on the endo front how often I have patients who are like, oh, I throw up and pass out from my period since I was 12 and thought that was normal. And I'm like, nah, like that's not normal at all. And also some medical doctors who have gaslit them into thinking that is normal. And I'm just like, no. So I think that it's one of these things where I really just wish that women knew what was normal, what was not normal about their bodies, so that they have the power and I feel like somewhere to ground from in advocating for themselves, because it's really hard to advocate for yourself anyway, but especially when you don't know and you just have a sense that just doesn't feel right, but so-and-so tells me it is, so it must be, right? And who end up suffering for longer periods of time than they need to. Anyways, I can rant about that all day, but I really appreciate it when people know about their body's full stop.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we always say internally too is we deeply appreciate why you Google things. And you might not have come to the right conclusion, but it gives us information about the right path. And we have a society of women who are more educated and have more resources available to them than ever before, and they still don't know what to do with them. And I think that's, again, where we're so passionate about saying, okay, what if we just connect this one little dot for you, and then you can turn and go in that direction and then come back with a deeper understanding. And it's this balance point that I think is so critical. So yeah, no, love that so much.
Yeah. And then the last little tidbit would be our vagina is a self-cleaning oven, and please don't be throwing fragrances and like body washes and things like that in there. That if we have an infection, it needs treatment, and otherwise leave your vagina alone. Discharge is normal. Go listen.
Well, do what you want to do with your vagina. Just don't put chemicals up.
Yes, correct. And listen to the podcast that we recorded about vaginal health. We talk about all of this, and there's
all the discharge. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, knowing about your discharge is important as a woman. So I'm like, circle back to that one.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Very good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Michelle. Always beautiful chatting with you, and we will have you back on here very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you had as much fun as we did. And if you loved today's episode, share it with a friend and leave us a review. That is how we spread this message, and that is how we are going to revolutionize healthcare in Canada for women. Have a beautiful day and be well.